welcome to my examination of Missing 411 Eastern United States. Today we're continuing Pennsylvania where we left off last time. Since we covered the chapter introduction last time, we'll just jump right in. Eldridge Albright. Eldridge, who was 3 years old at the time, went missing on May 21st, 1941, from Woodstock, Maryland, about 25 miles from the Pennsylvania border. Eldridge was alone with family dogs playing in a creek about 300 yards behind his home. His grandmother heard a call for help coming from that area, so she went out and investigated. As she was going, the cries for help got further and further away. The dogs were seen staring off down the creek when she arrived, holding stock still. Police thought that a tramp from a nearby train had kidnapped him, as this was the only theory that made sense. His footprints were in the sand near the stream for about 500 yards, but then they mysteriously disappeared. After a day of searching, Eldridge was found alive but groggy, protected from the elements under a rock ledge, laying on a bed of leaves, about 4 miles from his home in a swampy area. His shoes were missing, and his clothes were torn. The only thing he ever said about his disappearance was the word Twains. Let's review. The first 3 points are correct. The reports I read only noted there was one scream, not several cries going further and further away, but I guess that wouldn't be as compelling of a story. As for the dogs staring off down the creek, holding completely still, the sources that I was able to find also did not agree with that. The dogs went missing at the same time as Eldridge and came back later covered in brambles. I saw that there were concerns that he was murdered initially, due to a bloody axe being found nearby. As for him being protected in this shelter, he was not that protected because he was noted to have been pretty badly sunburned. It's also specified that he was the one who made the bed of leaves. And also, it was 3 miles, not 4. And you probably already guessed it, but he did in fact say much more than a single word about his disappearance. He said that he didn't get anything to eat or drink. He responded with Twains when asked where he went. So with that piece of context, we can put together that he went off on his own volition to see trains. Plus, he was 3 and recovering from the most frightening experience of his life. I don't know how much more you want him to say about it. Up next is Betty Bossier. Betty, who was 3 years old at the time, went missing on June 24th, 1941, from Altoona, Pennsylvania. She was playing with children on a neighboring farm when she wandered off at some point. Nobody remembered seeing her leave. Canines couldn't find her. 28 hours later, she was found sitting on a rock in dense brush. Doctors deemed her to be in satisfactory condition. Then we get this quote from Paulides. Quote, "Why can't canines seem to track missing people that are written about in these books?" Close quote. Let's review. I'm pretty sure that this case is only included to bolster the number of cases where canines couldn't find a missing person, but we'll review anyway. Paulides doesn't note the distance, but she was between 500 and 1,500 yards away from where she went missing. That is to say, less than a mile. And what's funny to me about Paulides posing this question in this particular case is that a dog handler directly answers this very question. Quote, "The bloodhounds are having a tough time because the trail is cold. I'm afraid we can't expect too much from them." Close quote. Sometimes bloodhounds are successful. They aren't a catch-all. They don't always work. They're just a tool that we can use that sometimes does indeed help find people. Joseph Prato. Joseph, who was 19 months old at the time, went missing on October 25th, 1941, from Bald Eagle Mountain, Pennsylvania. Joseph wandered from his home at 12:30 p.m. At noon the next day, searchers found Joseph 2 miles away, alive but laying on the ground. He was asleep even though it was noon, which is strange. Joseph had removed his pants, shoes, and socks, even though it was below 50 degrees that night. It is not understood how he traveled so far or survived the night without clothes. Let's review. The first points are correct, or at the very least, close enough. Children his age need between 11 and 14 hours of sleep per day. Assuming that he was up the majority of the night, distressed from being lost, of course he was still asleep at noon. As for the missing clothes and the chilly night, yes, that's true. But as we've seen time and time again, it is not uncommon for children to remove their clothing. What he fails to mention is that this child was notably a little overweight, and he also had a sweater. Considering the sweater and his increased insulation, shall we say, that would have helped stave off the cold. As for how he traveled so far or survived the night, I think it is perfectly understood. He had a sweater, as we already talked about, and as for how he got so far, he followed a path. Alvan Diggan. Alvan, who was 3 years old at the time, went missing on May 30th, 1942, from Montgomery, Pennsylvania. While his parents were picking strawberries, Alvan wandered off. A search involving Air Patrol, law enforcement, and bloodhounds were launched not long after he disappeared. The hounds either refused to track or they couldn't pick up the scent. We don't know which. 2 days into the search, he was found alive but sobbing in a pine grove about 2 miles away. He was naked and cut from briars, but was otherwise okay. His clothes were never found. In review, points 1 and 2 are correct, but point 3 is false. His parents waited until the evening to report him missing, as they believed that he would return to the berry patch all on his own. As for him being fine, that's not really the case, considering that he was also suffering from exposure. His feet were badly cut from walking without shoes. I'm not sure why he left that out. His clothes were noted to have been ripped off his body by the thick brush. I somehow doubt that much time was spent looking for his overalls and jacket in the woods, but it's pretty well explained that that's what happened. Eugene Shue. Eugene, who was 3 years old at the time, went missing on October 20th, 1946, from Mannheim, Pennsylvania. Martha, Eugene's mother, sent him outside with a sandwich and the family dog as she went on an errand. When she returned, they were both gone. A search was launched that afternoon. 2 days into searching, Eugene was found at the base of a lookout on the top of a 600-foot mountain, 4 miles from where he had gone missing. He was alive and without scratches. The dog, however, was never found. Let's review. I want to clarify point 4. He was found 2 miles from his house on the road going up the mountain to a fire tower. He was then brought up to the tower by searchers because they were looking for a landline to use. Keep in mind this was 1946. I have some good news for everyone. The dog was actually found. 20 minutes after Eugene was returned home, the dog appeared in the woods in the back of the house. But there was actually quite a lot of people who thought he was abducted and dropped off where he was found. His shoes weren't muddy, his clothes weren't torn or wet, and there were tire tracks nearby, and his dog wasn't with him. There's a lot of oddness here that is normally reported in Missing 411, was just completely left out here. Jimmy Sensor. Jimmy, who was 4 years old at the time, went missing on April 6th, 1947, from Phillipsburg, Pennsylvania. Jimmy was playing with his 2 siblings outside while his parents prepared for Easter dinner. At 5 p.m., his parents came to call on the kids and realized that Jimmy was missing. A search was launched, including aircraft, trucks with loudspeakers, firemen, law enforcement, and volunteers. Jimmy's red sweater was found 500 yards away from his home on some railroad tracks, with barefoot prints nearby. The area was treacherous, with abandoned coal mines. Canines were brought in, but unable to track, even though the footprints were present, which is very odd. He was never found. Let's review. This case is actually correctly represented. The only thing I question, and I'm not going to count this against missing 411 per se as a mistake, but I just question why it's odd that canines were unable to track, even though there were footprints. Dogs do not track visually, or at least bloodhounds don't. They're trained to track via smell, especially since the footprints were right next to a water hole formed by an abandoned coal mine. Between the dogs and the footprints, it may point to him drowning in the hole and just never being found, but scent can actually drift pretty far off of where they actually were. So just saying that there were footprints and it's an assumption that they were his footprints doesn't necessarily mean that the dog should be able to track. Let's move on. Ronald Collier. Ronald, who was 2 years old at the time, went missing on July 2nd, 1948, from Somerset, Pennsylvania. He was on the front porch of a vacation cabin with his mother when she left him alone to fetch a bottle for him. When she returned, he was gone. There were no bears in the area, according to game wardens. His parents were suspected by the frustrated sheriff, and he administered lie detector tests to them, and they passed. He was never found. Let's review. I had an incredibly hard time finding sources for this case until I realized that Paulides got the missing boy's name wrong. His name was Donald Collier. And yes, apparently his mother did leave him alone while going to get him a bottle, though when she returned and saw that he was gone, she apparently thought that he had gone to be with his father, so the alarm wasn't immediately raised. As for this so-called frustrated sheriff, we once again see Paulides, a former law enforcement officer himself, at least according to him, throwing law enforcement under the bus. The sheriff administered those tests despite personally believing that Donald was lost in the woods in order to quell the wild, baseless rumors surrounding the case. In other words, he administered that test to the parents to clear their names so that the public would quit harassing them. Next is Billy Abbott. Billy, who was 3 years old at the time, went missing on February 18th, 1949, from Laureldale, Pennsylvania. The family home was at the base of Mount Laurel at a 1,000 feet elevation. He went with his friends to play at a ski resort. Somehow, he got separated from them, and his friends returned without him. Authorities were called by his mother. As the search was underway, his parents said that he must have been abducted, as he would have come home if he hadn't been. On the second day of searching, Billy was found unconscious at about 1 p.m., about 5 blocks from his home. His clothing wasn't dirty or wet, and he wasn't hungry and seemed to be in very good spirits. He was questioned about his disappearance, and he stated that he followed a dog into the woods, but he refused to answer anything else. He said that he stayed in a house that night he went missing, and made no further statements. Let's review. The circumstances under which he went missing are a little bit more complicated than are portrayed in the book. He started out in his backyard, then he watched some tree trimmers, then he followed the kids from the neighborhood. But to be fair to Missing 411, it is the short version of what happened, and I would call that accurate enough. As for how far he was found, I don't really understand why he measured it in blocks. He was found more than a mile away in a clearing on the side of the mountain. As for being in good spirits, that's about as far away from the truth as you can get. Papers described him as too frightened to even walk. Just about every article described him as being very frightened and or crying. As for the statements that he supposedly made and didn't make, This is also untrue. He did state initially that he went into the woods following a dog, but he also said that he went in alone, and another time that he was with a man and a dog. That is, he gave several versions of what happened. He did say that he stayed in a house, but he made further statements as well. For example, he also said that he slept in his own bed that night. It seems like he had quite the imagination. I realize that he imagined it all isn't a satisfying answer, but given the additional context of the different stories, as well as things that couldn't have happened, like I slept in my own bed, I think that we have to accept that the reality of a situation may not be a satisfying answer. Billy Clever. Billy, who was 3 years old at the time, went missing on April 26, 1949, from Mercerburg, Pennsylvania. Billy was mushroom hunting with his mother when he went missing. When she noticed, she gathered her other children and searched for him. Law enforcement were notified and bloodhounds were used, but to no effect. The next morning, Billy was found by a searcher 3 miles from where he had disappeared. He ran away from the searcher, but he was caught. His clothing was torn up, but he was in otherwise fine shape. The hospital also determined that he was in good condition. Let's review. This isn't the first time this has happened, but Paulides has unintentionally provided us with valuable insight to these missing children. Billy ran away from the searcher. I wonder if this indicates that other children have likely done the same thing. Paulides likes to complain when searchers call for children and they don't answer. I think that this case speaks to that at least sometimes the children elect to not respond. But putting that aside for now, let's review the facts. There are some conflicting reports. The most in-depth ones report that he was not intentionally brought along mushroom hunting. He had gone after his mother and another sibling without their knowledge. Bloodhounds were credited with aiding in the search. I didn't see any reports that said that they were unable to pick up a scent. There's some discrepancies about distances in the reports. Some say that he was found 1.5 miles away. Some do say 3 as well. He was scratched up as well, something that would seem obvious from torn clothing. But Paulides didn't note it in this case like he has in previous ones. And yes, the hospital did note that he was in relatively good condition considering. He was not suffering from exposure, though he had several scratches. Rest and food were the recommendations. Otis T. Mason. Otis, who was 6 years old at the time, went missing on October 11th, 1949, from Colesville, Maryland. Otis was playing in the yard with the family's 3 dogs. When he was called for dinner, it was discovered that he and the dogs were missing. When the mother couldn't locate Otis, authorities were called. Several hours later, 2 of the 3 dogs returned. 24 hours into the search, the 3rd dog was found inside an abandoned home's septic tank, 2 miles away with the lid closed. On the start of the 2nd day of searching, Otis's body was found in a creek. The creek was shallow except for the spot where the body was found, which was about 4 feet deep. This area had been searched many times already. An autopsy found that he had drowned. Paulides says that this case would not have been included if not for the strange location of the 3rd dog shut inside of a septic tank. Which I agree, that's wild. Let's see if we can get any more insight in review. Colesville is about 40 miles from the Pennsylvania border. I don't understand why this case doesn't appear in the Maryland section, but whatever. Let's get to the point that we're all wondering about. Newspapers do indeed report that a dog was found in an unused septic tank. But they don't say that the tank was closed, they just say that it was found there and they move on like it's not a big deal. I imagine if anybody thought that this was a purposeful thing, or if the tank was indeed closed, at least one source would have reported it that way. Otis was found in 1 to 2 feet of water, not 4 feet, and he wasn't in a hole, but he was under the overhanging bank. Further, it's actually explained that the area was searched again because they wanted to take a look at the overhanging bank, thinking that perhaps he was trapped there. Lo and behold, that's exactly where he was found. So, yes, the area was searched before, but the overhang where his body was trapped had not yet been searched. And yes, in addition to the autopsy that reported that he had drowned, police said that he had slipped from a log nearby where he was found. That will do it for now. There's still quite a few cases to cover in this chapter, and I don't want the video length running away. Next time we'll pick this up again. Until then, take care.